Regresó al rancho de su abuelo solo para limpiarlo y vender la tierra. Pero cuando abrió el viejo granero, vio dos cajas cubiertas con lona. Al quitarla, se dio cuenta de que su abuelo había estado ocultando un terrible secreto durante toda su vida. Suscríbete para no perderte la próxima historia y comenta desde dónde estás viendo este video. The mountains of northern Montana rose in the fading light, like the ribs of some ancient beast buried beneath the earth. A narrow dirt road wound between them, cracked with frost, lined with the gray bones of fence posts that once held cattle. Ethan Marlo drove slowly, the tires of his pickup crunching over the frozen ruts, the headlights cutting narrow tunnels through the dusk. It had been more than 10 years since he'd last seen this land, and as he drew closer, a strange mix of guilt and obligation pressed at his chest. He had promised himself he would never return, never breathe the air that had shaped his childhood and carried away everyone he loved. Yet here he was again, summoned not by sentiment but by necessity, the death of his grandfather, Henry Marlo, and the unspoken duty to settle what was left behind. The wind carried the smell of old grass and engine oil. It was the scent of his youth. Long summers baling hay, winters mending fences beside a man who spoke in silences more than in words. The land hadn't changed, though everything else had. It still looked raw, indifferent, eternal. When the road curved, the outline of the ranch appeared, a dark silhouette against the dim horizon. The sign that once read Marlo Ranch hung by a single chain, creaking as the wind pushed it back and forth. Ethan stopped the truck, stepped out, and placed his gloved hand on the wooden gate. The cold bit through the leather as the hinges groaned. Somewhere far off, a coyote cried, and its echo seemed to come from under the ground rather than across it. He expected ruin, a roof half collapsed, fences down, a graveyard of rusted machinery swallowed by weeds. But what he saw instead made him hesitate. The place was intact, preserved as though time had forgotten to pass here. The barn stood tall against the dim sky, boards dark with age but straight and solid. Beyond it, the house rose from the frost like a stubborn monument, dark windows, straight roofline, porch railings still white under the grime. It looked less abandoned than waiting. He parked beside the porch and turned off the engine. Silence rushed in like water. No crickets, no dogs, only the whisper of the wind moving through dry grass. The boards under his boots felt firm when he climbed the steps. He half expected them to crumble. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for the old brass key the lawyer had sent him. The lock turned too easily, smooth as if recently oiled. Inside, darkness swallowed him. He flicked on his flashlight and froze. Dust motes danced in the beam, but the room itself was spotless. The faint scent of pine soap lingered in the air. On the table stood a coffee mug and a single plate, both clean but still arranged as if waiting for breakfast. The floor had been swept. The chairs were pushed neatly under the table. There was no smell of decay, no sense of abandonment, only the unsettling impression that Henry Marlo might return at any moment, step through the door, and nod in that wordless way of his. Ethan's throat tightened. He'd imagined this house in ruins, as dead as the man who built it. Instead, it breathed with quiet order, as if someone had been taking care of it all along. The beam of his flashlight drifted to the fireplace mantel where framed photographs stood in their familiar places. Henry as a young soldier in uniform, jaw firm beneath the brim of an army cap. A black and white portrait of Ethan's parents. His mother smiling, his father's hand on her shoulder, both lost to the mountains years ago when their car slid off an icy road. Between them stood a smaller frame, a boy of 7 holding up a trout nearly as big as his arm, his grandfather's weathered hand resting on his shoulder. He remembered that day the cold bite of the river water, the smell of cedar, the rasp of Henry's voice. "You have to know the land, Ethan. It gives what it wants, not what you take." He found himself whispering, "You and your riddles, old man," though the sound of his own voice in the silence startled him. He moved through the rooms, the flashlight gliding across walls, furniture, the familiar corners of his childhood. In the study, the air was different, still, heavier. The desk stood where it always had, covered in neat stacks of yellowed papers, old bank statements, receipts, a ledger. In the center lay a single envelope, cream-colored, the name Ethan written in block letters with the careful hand of a man who carved words more easily into wood than onto paper. For Ethan, when the time comes. He hesitated, then tore it open. The handwriting inside was shaky but deliberate. If you're reading this, I'm gone. There are things I never said, things I couldn't say. Start with the barn, but be sure you want to know what's there. Some truths don't stay buried. He read the note twice. The barn. Of course it would be the barn. As a child, he had always been told to stay away from it. When he once asked why, Henry had said only, "Some places hold memories that aren't yours to carry." It had sounded like one of his usual cryptic warnings, the kind he gave instead of explanations. Now the words felt like something else, almost a confession. Ethan folded the note and slipped it into his jacket pocket. Outside, the last light of day had drained from the sky, leaving a smear of silver over the ridge. The idea of crossing the yard to the barn in the dark was foolish, but curiosity was already taking hold of him. He pulled on his gloves, stepped outside, and closed the door behind him. The wind had picked up, dragging wisps of snow across the ground. The barn loomed ahead, massive and still. He could just make out the padlock hanging from its clasp, and it was open. He frowned. His grandfather had always kept it locked with a heavy steel latch. He pushed the door, and it groaned on its hinges. The smell hit him immediately. Oil, dust, and something older beneath, faintly metallic, like rust in time. He clicked on the flashlight again. The beam sliced through the dark, sweeping across coiled ropes, shelves of tools, the hulking shape of an old tractor under a tarp. Dust drifted like smoke in the light, and then he saw them. 2 long wooden crates in the center of the floor, covered with thick army canvas. They were 6 feet long, maybe more, built from oak planks banded with iron. Around them, the hay was clean, too clean, as though someone had brushed it away recently. No cobwebs, no signs of rodents. Someone had been here not long ago. He approached slowly. The air seemed to grow denser with each step. The canvas was folded tight around the boxes, corners tucked in with deliberate precision. His gloved hand brushed the fabric. It was cold, damp from condensation. He thought of coffins and felt a chill crawl up his spine. On the second crate, the canvas sagged slightly in the middle. A rusted lantern rested on top beside an empty coffee cup, streaked inside with residue. He touched the rim. The coffee had dried, not evaporated. Days old at most. Circling the crates, he spotted boot prints in the dirt. Large, heavy, not his own. They led toward the rear of the barn, where the small back door stood ajar, its latch broken clean through. A faint smell of pine smoke drifted in from the dark. Every rational part of him said to leave, to go back to the truck, lock the doors, and call the sheriff in the morning. But something in him, a stubborn echo of Henry's blood, refused. Whatever his grandfather had hidden here, it was meant for him to find. The letter had made that clear. He crouched beside the first crate, tugged at a corner of the canvas, and peeled it back. Beneath it was a wooden lid, smooth and pale, fastened with long screws. In the beam of the flashlight, he saw a carved mark burned into the surface. 2 intersecting lines forming a crude X. The wood smelled faintly of varnish and smoke. He hesitated, then leaned closer, listening. The barn was silent, except for the wind outside, pushing through the gaps in the boards. A shutter banged somewhere on the upper loft. He jerked the light toward the door and froze. The barn door he had left half open was now wide, swinging slowly in the wind. Beyond it, the yard was empty. But when he turned the light toward the house, his stomach turned to ice. The front door stood open, light spilling from the porch lamp. He had locked it. He was sure of it. He switched off the flashlight and listened. The silence was thick, almost solid. Then came the faint creak of a floorboard from inside the house. A deliberate sound, too heavy for wind. Ethan's jaw tightened. His pulse hammered in his ears as he stepped backward toward the open door. The cold night air clawed at his face. He wanted to believe it was nothing, a draft, an old hinge, but he knew better. He turned once more toward the crates, their silent forms hunched beneath the canvas, and then back toward the porch where the light flickered as though something had passed in front of it. He walked slowly across the yard, each footstep crunching in the frost, every sense alive with dread. The front door moved again, inching wider, as if inviting him in. He stopped at the bottom of the steps, the flashlight trembling in his hand. Inside, the lamp on the table flickered, though no switch had been touched. The wind stilled, and the world held its breath. Something fell inside, a dull, heavy thud, like a body hitting the floor. Ethan froze. The sound came from deep within the house. He took one careful step onto the porch, and another. His heart beat hard against his ribs. Beyond the open door, the light wavered again, a ghostly pulse across the walls. He tightened his grip on the flashlight and whispered into the cold, "Who's there?" No answer came. Only the house, breathing. The next gust of wind rattled the eaves, and the lamp went out. The darkness that followed felt alive. And Ethan Marlo, standing in the doorway of his grandfather's house, realized for the first time that he might not be alone on the ranch after all. The echo of the falling sound still lingered in Ethan's ears as he stepped inside. The air was motionless, thick with cold, and the faint smell of old wood polish clung to everything. His flashlight's beams swept across the familiar furniture, the same table, the same clock above the fireplace, the same armchair where Henry used to sit reading the paper. Nothing was out of place, and yet everything felt wrong. The silence seemed heavier than it had been moments ago, as if the house itself were listening. He moved slowly through the kitchen first, trying to follow the direction from which the noise had come. The lamp that had flickered now lay cold and dark, its bulb intact. He paused by the counter, where a thin film of dust revealed no fingerprints but his own. Every drawer, every cupboard was closed. He crouched to check beneath the table, nothing. Only his own breathing filled the space, shallow and uneven. It was possible, he told himself, that a shutter had blown loose upstairs, or something had fallen from a shelf. Old houses had their own way of making sounds, but deep down, he didn't believe it. The hallway stretched ahead of him, narrow and dim, the floorboards sighing beneath his boots. When he reached the door to Henry's bedroom, he hesitated, hand on the knob. The wood was warm, though the rest of the house felt freezing. He pushed the door open. The bed was neatly made, the sheets smooth as if untouched. The smell of tobacco lingered faintly in the air, mixed with something medicinal. On the nightstand lay a Bible, open to a page near the end of Revelation, and beside it a pair of glasses folded precisely in half. Ethan felt a sudden wave of grief he hadn't expected, something like anger at the quietness of it all, as though death had left too politely, without saying goodbye. He moved on, checking the small bedroom that had once been his. The quilt was folded military tight, his childhood fishing rod still propped in the corner. For a moment he could almost see himself at 10 years old, lying awake at night listening to his grandfather's heavy footsteps pacing the hall. The muffled creak of the floorboards, a comfort, then rather than a warning. Now the same sound haunted him. He turned off the flashlight and stood still, eyes adjusting to the faint gray light leaking through the curtains. Then he heard it again, a creak, faint but deliberate, from somewhere below. The sound of a door latch. He spun, heart hammering, but saw nothing moving. The stillness returned. He turned the key in the lock of his old room, slid the bolt across, and sat down on the edge of the bed. For several minutes he listened. Nothing. Eventually exhaustion pressed down on him, heavier than fear. When morning came, pale and brittle through the frost-coated window, Ethan felt as though he'd slept only in fragments. The house looked different in daylight, stripped of its menace, though the silence had not left. He brewed coffee on the old stove, the bitter smell grounding him. Outside, mist crawled across the pasture, and through it he saw faint lines in the dirt beyond the fence tire marks. Fresh ones. Someone had driven up to the property in the night. He pulled on his jacket and went outside. The air was knife cold. His breath rose in small clouds. The barn stood in the distance, its doors closed, the frost along its hinges catching the light. He crossed the yard, boots crunching over the ground, and noticed something he hadn't before. An old wooden ladder leaning against the barn's side, half buried in grass and snow. Above it, near the roofline, a small hatch was set into the siding, the entrance to the loft he'd been forbidden to climb as a child. The key. He remembered the brass key from the desk in his grandfather's room, the one labeled in fading pencil, Upper room. At the time, he'd thought it odd. The house had no upstairs. Now the answer stood before him. He climbed the ladder slowly, each rung groaning under his weight. The air grew colder the higher he went. When he reached the hatch, he tried the latch. It was corroded but intact. The brass key slid in smoothly, turned with a reluctant click. A breath of dust fell into his face as the trapdoor swung open. The loft smelled of dry wood and old paper, the air thick and unmoving. Shafts of light pierced the slats in the walls, painting thin bars across the floor. Boxes were stacked neatly along the rafters, untouched for decades. Everything was covered in a fine layer of dust. Everything except one corner, where the floorboards were clear. There, against the far wall, stood a wooden chest bound with two cracked leather straps. Its lid bore the initials HM, carved deep into the surface. Ethan crossed the floor carefully, testing each step before putting his weight on it. The boards groaned but held. When he reached the chest, he knelt and brushed the dust from the lid with his sleeve. The brass clasp came undone easily. Too easily. He hesitated, then lifted the lid. Inside lay bundles of letters tied together with thin twine. The envelopes were yellowed, their corners curled. He took one at random and unfolded it. The handwriting was fine, careful, feminine, nothing like Henry's blunt scrawl. The date read June 12th, 1958. You promised you'd come back with him alive. I've prayed every night since, but I fear you've made me a liar. If anyone finds out what really happened, they'll take everything from us. He read the words twice before setting the letter down and picking up another. The man from the army came again. I told him you were sick, that you couldn't talk yet. He didn't believe me. They'll send someone else. Hide what you brought home. Hide it well. The name at the bottom was written in an elegant hand. Rachel Mercer. The name struck something in him, a faint memory, a sound he'd heard once but could not place. He searched through more letters. The tone changed gradually with the years, fear sharpening into bitterness, then fading into resignation. The last was dated 1962. If the boy ever asks, tell him nothing. Tell him his father died a hero. It's better that way for both of us. He sat back on his heels, the letters trembling slightly in his hands. The boy. Could she have meant his father? Henry's son, Ethan's own father. That couldn't be right. His grandmother had died young, or so the family had always said. Her name had never been mentioned. Had that been a lie too? As he sorted through the stack, a small packet slipped free and fell to the floor. It was a photograph, creased and grainy. Two men in military uniform stood shoulder to shoulder before a tent, the younger one grinning. Henry was unmistakable, his jaw square, his eyes steady. The other man was tall, lean, with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. On the back, in Henry's handwriting, were the words Raymond and me, Korea, 1953. Beneath that, written later in blue ink, someone had added, he's still here. Ethan stared at the words until they blurred. The light filtering through the slats seemed to dim, or maybe the air simply grew heavier around him. The phrase, he's still here, echoed in his mind like a whisper that refused to fade. Still here, alive, buried, hidden. The dust in the loft began to itch at his throat. He needed air. He tucked the photograph into his pocket, closed the chest, and climbed down the ladder. Outside, the mist had lifted, revealing the barren sweep of the pasture stretching toward the tree line. The sky had turned a hard, pale blue, yet something about the stillness felt unnatural. The wind had shifted, carrying with it a faint thread of smoke. Somewhere nearby, someone had lit a fire. He turned slowly in place, scanning the horizon. No movement, no sign of life. But the scent was unmistakable, fresh wood smoke mixed with the sharp tang of pine. Someone else was on the property. His first instinct was to call the sheriff, to let someone else unravel whatever this was. But the thought died almost instantly. The letter from Henry had been written for him, not for anyone else. Start with the barn, his grandfather had said, but he hadn't told him to stop. He crossed the yard toward the house, the photograph burning in his pocket like a live coal. The wind rattled the windows, and for a moment he thought he saw movement behind the curtains, a flicker of shadow that vanished when he blinked. Back inside, the air had grown colder. The light through the windows was harsh now, washing the colors from the walls. Ethan set the letters on the table, spread them out like a map of secrets, and stared at them until the words blurred together. The names, the dates, the hidden fear in every line, all of it pointed toward one truth he couldn't yet face. Henry Marlo had brought something home from the war, something that Rachel Mercer had wanted buried forever, and somewhere on this land it was still waiting. He moved to the window. Beyond the frost-streaked glass, the barn stood silent, the doors glinting faintly in the light. For a long time he simply stared, trying to decide whether to go back inside, to open the second crate, to confront whatever truth his grandfather had locked away. Then just as he turned from the window, something caught his eye, a thin, almost invisible column of smoke rising from the far ridge beyond the creek. Someone was there, watching. And as he stood frozen, the smell of burning pine reached him again, sharp and unmistakable. The past was not done with him yet. The smoke on the ridge faded with the wind, but its scent lingered long after the column had disappeared. Ethan stood at the window until the ache in his shoulders reminded him he'd been holding himself tense for too long. Whoever had been there was gone now, or hiding. The thought sent a shiver through him. He turned back to the letters spread across the table, their paper trembling slightly in the draft. The words he'd read upstairs looped again in his mind. Hide what you brought home. Hide it well. He poured a cup of coffee that had long gone cold and took a swallow anyway, the bitterness grounding him. His reflection in the window looked older than he remembered, his eyes hollow, his skin pale against the dim light. The man staring back didn't look like someone returning home. He looked like someone trespassing on a grave. The photograph of Henry and the soldier, Raymond Mercer, was still in his jacket pocket. He pulled it out, studied the faces once more, and then his eyes caught the words on the back. He's still here. He didn't know why, but the phrase tugged at him like a thread that demanded to be pulled. By mid-afternoon, the sky had turned the color of pewter. The wind had calmed, and the silence across the property felt almost deliberate. Ethan zipped up his jacket and crossed the yard to the barn again. Each step made a faint crunch in the frost. The padlock still hung from its clasp, swinging gently, as though waiting for him. Inside, the air was heavy with dust and the faint metallic scent of oil. The beam of his flashlight cut through the dim interior, tracing along the rows of tools and machinery until it landed on the two crates at the center. They looked exactly as he'd left them, except that the nearest one seemed cleaner than before. Its canvas cover less wrinkled, the brass fittings glinting faintly as though they'd been polished. He frowned. No one should have been here. The memory of the fresh tire tracks made his stomach tighten. He walked closer, kneeling beside the first crate, and ran his hand along the brass latch. It gleamed in the light, untouched by corrosion. Someone had opened it recently. The air around it smelled faintly of something sharp and chemical oil, maybe, or varnish. He loosened the canvas cover, peeled it back, and found the lid beneath. Pale wood, smooth with the carved X he had noticed before. The screws holding it in place looked old, but one corner had been pried up slightly, leaving a thin, splintered gap. He slid his fingers under it and felt a cold draft seeping through. Taking a deep breath, he wedged the screwdriver from his pocket into the crack and worked the lid free. The wood creaked as it lifted. A gust of stale air escaped, smelling of iron and time. Inside lay a collection of old tools, axes, saws, a folded tarp, and beneath them a bundle of documents bound by frayed twine. He pulled them out and brushed off the dust. The papers were military forms, their ink faded but legible. At the top of each page was a faintly stamped seal, United States Army Classified Personnel Report. The name repeated through all of them, Private Raymond M. Mercer. The words missing in action. Presumed dead appeared at least half a dozen times. Beneath the papers was a smaller object wrapped in cloth. Ethan unwrapped it carefully and found a metal identification tag, the chain still attached. The surface was tarnished, but the lettering was clear. Mercer Raymond M. Serial 082349. When he turned it over, his breath caught. Scratched crudely into the back were three words. He shot me. The tag slipped from his fingers and hit the wood with a faint clink. For a long moment he just stared at it. The air in the barn seemed to thicken until it was hard to breathe. His grandfather's voice echoed somewhere in memory. Some truths don't stay buried. Was this what he'd meant? Had Henry Marlo, the man who'd raised him, killed his friend? Ethan backed away from the crate, his heart hammering. The beam of his flashlight jumped across the floor, landing on the second crate. It looked unchanged, the canvas still tightly wrapped, but suddenly the thought of what might be beneath it filled him with dread. He turned toward the barn door, trying to steady his breathing. The cold air outside called to him. He needed light, distance, something real. He stepped out into the yard and froze. At the top of the ridge where the smoke had been earlier, 2 points of white light gleamed through the tree's headlights. A vehicle sat motionless, its engine low and distant, a hum just audible through the wind. A black pickup. He could see its outline clearly against the fading sky. Someone was there, watching. He waited, every nerve tight, but the truck didn't move. After what felt like minutes, the headlights blinked out. The silence that followed was worse than the sound. He strained his eyes, but the ridge was empty. The truck had vanished without even the faintest trace of motion. He ran a hand over his face and turned back toward the barn. Inside, the darkness felt thicker now, as though it had shifted while he was gone. The crates stood in their place, but a faint odor hung in the air that hadn't been there before. Something metallic, unmistakably close to the scent of blood. He swallowed hard, shone the flashlight across the floor, and caught sight of a small patch of dark moisture near the base of the first crate. He crouched, touched it with the edge of his glove. It was tacky, red-brown against the light. Fresh. A sound came from above, the faintest creak, like a footstep in the loft. He jerked the light upward, scanning the rafters, but saw only shadows. Dust floated lazily through the beam. The boards overhead were still. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was up there, watching. His thoughts tangled. The polished latch, the boot prints, the open padlock, the smoke on the ridge. None of it fit neatly together, and yet every piece pointed to a single truth. Someone else knew what was in these crates, and they wanted him gone. He forced himself to move toward the second crate. The beam of the flashlight trembled as it crossed the canvas. The air was colder here. He rested a hand on the fabric, felt the chill through his glove, and imagined for an instant that something beneath the cover shifted, as if the wood exhaled. He drew back, heartbeat quickening. Maybe it was his imagination, but the silence had become alive, pulsing. The temptation to uncover it was overwhelming, but something, perhaps instinct, perhaps fear, held him back. Not yet. He needed to understand what he had already found before facing whatever waited in the other box. He turned and walked quickly toward the door. The barn's old timbers groaned as if relieved to let him go. Outside, twilight had deepened into night. The wind had dropped, leaving the land unnaturally still. The house stood with its windows dark, the porch lamp flickering weakly. He stopped halfway across the yard and glanced back. The barn doors swayed slightly, though there was no wind. A sliver of light glimmered between them, faint and shifting, like a lantern swinging somewhere inside. He hadn't left any light burning. He felt the urge to call out, to demand who was there, but the words died in his throat. Instead, he watched, waiting. The light moved once more, then went out completely. When he finally reached the porch, the boards creaked under his boots. He took the steps 2 at a time, every muscle tense. The front door was still open, the faint glow from inside spilling across the threshold. He had left it closed when he went out. He was certain of it. He entered cautiously, sweeping the flashlight across the room. Everything was as before, the table, the letters, the photograph. Yet something had changed. A smell of cold air and dust hung thicker than before, and his coffee mug had been moved a few inches to the left. A small thing, almost meaningless, but enough to twist his stomach. Someone had been in here, not long ago. He checked each room, moving quietly, methodically. No footprints in the dust, no open windows. But the feeling persisted. He was not alone. He climbed the stairs to the small bedroom, checked the closet, the corners, even under the bed. Nothing. The wind pressed faintly against the walls, the only sound. Standing there in the silence, he realized something else. The barn doors, the latch, the headlights on the ridge. None of it could have been coincidence. Whoever was behind it knew about Henry's secret, maybe even the letters. Perhaps they had been guarding it all this time. He returned to the study, picked up the note his grandfather had left him, and read it again. Be sure you want to know what's there. The meaning deepened now, darkened. Henry hadn't just been warning him about some painful memory. He had been warning him about danger. He sank into the chair, the wood creaking softly beneath him, and stared at the words until they blurred. Outside, the wind began to rise again, whispering along the eaves. Somewhere beyond the window, in the field near the barn, he thought he saw movement, a flicker of shadow that passed quickly through the darkness and was gone. Ethan sat motionless, gripping the flashlight, his pulse a steady drum in his ears. The land outside was silent again, but he could feel it breathing, listening. Somewhere out there, someone was waiting. He thought of the words scratched into the metal tag, the final accusation of a dying man. He shot me, and as he turned off the light and looked toward the dark shape of the barn through the window, Ethan understood that what had been buried here was not just a secret, it was a wound, one that still bled, even after all these years. Morning broke gray and silent, the kind of light that drains color from the world. Ethan had hardly slept, the weight of the dog tag still heavy in his pocket, like a confession he couldn't unread. He sat at the kitchen table, staring into a cup of coffee gone cold. The image of the words "he shot me" haunted every blink. The smell of oil and dust still clung to his jacket, and somewhere in the house, a loose window frame tapped softly against the wind like a nervous heartbeat. He told himself he would leave, drive into town, call the sheriff, let someone else deal with the barn. But every time he pictured doing it, a strange guilt stopped him. Something in his grandfather's voice from that letter, that plea that sounded like both warning and invitation. He couldn't walk away. Not yet. When he finally stepped outside, the air felt colder than it should have, the kind of cold that carried secrets. Frost glistened on the grass, and the windmill creaked lazily against the sky. He followed the faint tire marks from the day before. They led directly to the barn, looping around and vanishing back toward the road. Whoever had been there had come back more than once. The barn's great doors stood slightly ajar. He hadn't left them that way. His hand paused on the edge of the wood, the hinges groaning softly as he pushed them open. The smell hit him before the light did, old, stale, and heavy with the copper tang of rot. He lifted the flashlight and froze. The first crate stood open, its contents disturbed, the papers and tools scattered across the dirt floor. The second crate, the one he hadn't touched, now sat in the middle of the barn as if someone had dragged it there. The canvas was gone. Its lid was shifted, pried loose on one side. A slow dread crept through him as he stepped closer. The air grew thicker, harder to breathe. He knelt, set the beam of light across the inside of the crate, and recoiled. Beneath the remnants of an army blanket lay bones clean in some places, mummified in others. The skull rested on a folded jacket, its empty sockets staring up at him through decades of silence. A rusted identification tag hung from a cord around the neck. It read, Mercer Raymond M. For a long moment, Ethan couldn't move. The truth of it filled the air like smoke. His grandfather hadn't just hidden relics from the war. He'd hidden a body. At first, he thought it might have been some kind of burial, an attempt to bring a fallen comrade home. But then he noticed something else, a small folded scrap of paper tucked between the ribs. He reached for it with trembling fingers and unfolded it carefully. The ink was faded, the handwriting delicate but firm. He said it was an accident. But I saw him pull the trigger. The words blurred as his vision swam. His throat went dry. He stumbled back from the crate, knees hitting the dirt, trying to breathe through the tightness in his chest. His grandfather had killed this man, and someone. Maybe Rachel Mercer herself had witnessed it. He didn't hear the footsteps at first. Only when the door's shadow shifted did he turn. A figure stood in the threshold, backlit by the dim light outside. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark coat and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low. For a moment, Ethan thought his mind was playing tricks, conjuring ghosts from old photographs. Then the man spoke, his voice low and rough. You shouldn't have opened them, son. Ethan's mouth went dry. Who are you? The man didn't answer immediately. He stepped closer, the boards creaking beneath his boots. The light from the flashlight caught his face line, but not old. His eyes pale and unreadable. His gaze flicked to the open crate, lingered there, and something like sorrow crossed his features. You've done enough damage already, he said quietly. Some things ought to stay where they were put. Ethan's hand tightened around the flashlight. You were the one watching from the ridge. The man said nothing. He looked around the barn, his movements slow, deliberate. For a moment, Ethan thought he saw grief flicker behind the man's composure, a pain buried too deep to name. Whatever this is, Ethan said, forcing his voice steady, you'd better explain it. The stranger met his eyes. You don't want me to. Then he turned and walking toward the door. Leave it alone. You have no idea what it cost to bury this. Before Ethan could react, the man was gone. The sound of his footsteps faded into the wind, and when Ethan stepped outside, the yard was empty. No footprints, no tire tracks, nothing. He stood there for a long time, staring at the horizon, the wind slicing through his jacket. The land around him looked as it always had, but it no longer felt like the place he'd known. It felt haunted, not by spirits, but by memory. When he finally went back inside the house, his nerves raw, he locked every door and window. The shadows on the walls had grown longer with the sinking sun. He poured a drink, more out of instinct than need, and set the glass on the table beside Henry's letter. He traced the words with his finger. Start with the barn. He hadn't told him what came next. The wind howled outside, rattling the shutters. He leaned back in the chair, trying to think, when he noticed something on the table that hadn't been there before. A folded piece of paper. His pulse jumped. He reached for it, unfolded it with shaking hands. The handwriting was unfamiliar, hurried, the letters slanted and uneven. Stop digging. The next thing you find will kill you too. Ethan's breath caught. He looked around the room, the corners swallowed in half shadow. Every creak of the floorboards made his skin crawl. He turned off the lamp, crossed to the window and peered out. The yard was empty. The barn stood still under the pale light of the moon. He told himself it was a threat meant to scare him off, but the words on the page carried something deeper, a warning written by someone who knew exactly what was hidden here. He thought of the man's voice, that calm certainty when he said, "You shouldn't have opened them." Whoever he was, he hadn't lied. Ethan folded the note and slipped it into his pocket beside the dog tag. The two pieces of metal and paper felt like weights dragging him further into his grandfather's secrets. He poured another drink and stared at the flickering flame of the oil lamp until it blurred. Outside, the wind fell away, leaving the world utterly still. The quiet was complete, almost suffocating. He could hear his own heartbeat, the creak of the old beams settling in the walls. Somewhere beyond the window, a raven cried once, its voice cutting through the night before fading into silence. He went to the front door, tested the lock twice, then turned back toward the table. The note lay open again, though he was certain he'd folded it. The words stared up at him from the paper like an accusation. The next thing you find will kill you too. Ethan sank into the nearest chair, every instinct screaming that the stranger wasn't done with him. The house felt alive, pulsing with secrets that pressed against the walls. He closed his eyes, but the darkness behind them offered no rest. Only the echo of the man's voice and the ghostly whisper of his grandfather's warning. Be sure you want to know what's there. He did want to know. But as the clock ticked past midnight, the truth no longer felt like something waiting to be found. It felt like something already awake, moving just beyond the edge of light, patient and inevitable. Ethan awoke before dawn, the house creaking softly around him. For a long moment he lay still, listening. The storm from the night before had passed, leaving only the sound of the windmill turning lazily against the pale morning sky. He sat up, his head heavy, his mind replaying the image of the open crate and the skull staring at him from the shadows. The stranger's warning echoed through his thoughts. You shouldn't have opened them. The note he had found still lay on the table, its words burned into his memory. Stop digging. But it was too late for that. The truth was no longer buried. It was breathing in the cold morning air. He poured himself a coffee, black and bitter, and stood at the window, watching the barn through the fog. Its roof glistened with dew, the doors sealed shut again, though he hadn't touched them after returning to the house. Whoever had been here last night had closed them. Something inside him hardened. He needed answers. Not warnings, not fragments. Answers. He dressed quickly and stepped outside, the cold biting through his jacket. The yard smelled of wet hay and pine. The fog hung low, muffling the world into silence. As he approached the barn, his boots sank into damp earth. The lock that had been broken now hung in place again, freshly fixed with a new bolt. He pulled it free. It wasn't secured. A message perhaps, or a challenge. Inside, the air was heavy, still faintly metallic. The crates remained where they had been, but something drew his eyes to the far wall, where a section of boards looked slightly off color. He approached, ran his hand along the wood, and felt the faint outline of a seam. He pried at it, and a narrow panel came loose, revealing a small recess behind the boards. Inside was a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. He unrolled it carefully on the workbench. A revolver lay within, old but well kept, its metal dull with age. Alongside it was a folded sheet of paper in Henry Marlo's unmistakable handwriting. Ethan unfolded it slowly. "If you found this, then you've gone too far. I didn't mean for it to happen. We argued, and he wouldn't listen. He wanted to take her away, to expose everything. I tried to stop him. The shot was meant to warn him, not to kill him. But the land doesn't forgive. Neither did she. There was a woman that night, Rachel. She saw everything. Don't look for her. She won't forgive either." The letter shook in his hands. His grandfather's voice came alive in his head. No longer the calm, distant man he remembered, but someone cornered, desperate. The revolver beside the letter gleamed faintly, a silent witness to all of it. He looked again toward the barn door. The fog outside was thinning, and through it he could see movement near the fence line, a shape emerging from the mist. A man, tall, wearing a dark coat, the same one who had appeared before. Ethan stepped outside, heart pounding. "You!" he shouted. The man stopped, his breath misting in the cold air. When he turned, the light caught his face fully for the first time. The resemblance was immediate, sharp jaw, familiar eyes, the same quiet steadiness Henry had carried. "You've been watching me," Ethan said. "Why? Who are you?" The man's gaze softened, though his voice remained steady. "Rachel Mercer was my mother," he said. "Henry Marlo was my father. That makes us brothers, whether you like it or not." The world seemed to tilt beneath Ethan's feet. "That's not possible," he said, though even as the words left his mouth, the photograph upstairs, the letters, the names, everything fell into place. The boy Rachel had written about, the truth Henry had hidden. The stranger stepped closer. "You think you came back here for inheritance or closure, but you came to open wounds that never healed. I spent my whole life keeping them closed." Ethan stared at him, the fog swirling between them. "Why threaten me? Why all this?" "Because once the law finds what's in that barn, they'll drag his name through the dirt. Our name. Everything he built will be torn apart, and so will you." "I'm not the one who buried a man under his floor," Ethan said bitterly. "No," the man replied, "but you're the one who can finish what he started, or destroy it completely." He paused, his eyes distant. "I came here to make sure it ends. We burn it, we bury the truth again, and you walk away." Ethan shook his head. "You think covering it up will fix it? He murdered someone." "He killed his best friend," the man said, voice cracking for the first time. "Not out of hate, out of fear. He loved Rachel, but she loved Raymond. When Raymond found out about me, he threatened to take her and tell the world." Henry snapped. "It wasn't supposed to happen, but it did. Rachel left, took me away, and I grew up with her shame." The wind carried their words across the empty yard. For a moment, neither spoke. Ethan felt a deep, unfamiliar pity, tangled with the same anger that had driven him since he'd returned. "You think you're protecting his legacy," he said quietly, "but all you're doing is repeating his lie." The man's expression hardened. "You don't know what this truth does to people. It ruins everything it touches. If you don't walk away, it'll ruin you too. Ethan took a step forward. I can't. I need to know everything. I deserve that much. The stranger's jaw tightened. Then you'll regret it. He turned and began walking toward the edge of the property. Ethan watched him disappear into the thinning mist, his dark coat blending into the gray of the land. When the fog finally lifted, he was gone, leaving only the echo of his words hanging in the air. Ethan stood alone, the cold biting through his clothes, the revolver and letter heavy in his pocket. He returned to the barn one last time before nightfall. The silence inside pressed down on him. He stared at the open crate and the remains within. His grandfather's guilt, his family's secret, his own inheritance. On the edge of the crate, faint smudges marked the wood-fresh fingerprints. The man had been here again, touching the bones, perhaps saying his own silent farewell. Ethan reached out, running his hand over the marks. They were still damp with oil or sweat, proof of the living man tied forever to the dead beneath his feet. He felt no victory in knowing the truth, only a weary, hollow understanding. The sins of Henry Marlo were not buried with him, they lived on in both of his sons. As he left the barn, a folded note fluttered loose from the doorway. It was pinned there with a small nail, the paper still clean and new. He pulled it free, recognizing the handwriting instantly. Meet me by the creek at sunset. Tonight it ends. Ethan's pulse quickened. The words carried no threat this time, only finality. He folded the note, slipped it into his pocket beside the revolver, and looked toward the horizon where the sky was already deepening into the color of iron. The wind stirred through the grass, whispering across the field, as though the land itself waited for the last act to play out. And Ethan knew, without doubt, that before the night was over, only one of the Marlo brothers would still be standing. The sun hung low over the ridge when Ethan made his way toward the creek. The field stretched silent and gray around him, the wind cutting through the grass with a dry hiss. The note in his pocket felt like a summons, a line drawn between what had been hidden and what had to end. The revolver weighed against his hip beneath the coat, heavy and cold, as though it already knew how the night would end. The path to the creek wound through the skeletal remains of willows, their branches bowed beneath the frost. The water moved slow and dark, half covered by thin sheets of ice that cracked softly beneath the current. Across the clearing, near a fallen log, the stranger waited. His figure was still, his coat blending into the dying light. For the first time, Ethan noticed how much older the man looked now. His posture bent slightly, his expression stripped of the hard edge it had before. "You came," the man said quietly. "I had to," Ethan replied. "You wanted it to end tonight." "I did." The stranger's gaze lifted to the mountains, pale under the fading sun. "You've read his letters, I suppose. You know what he did." "I know enough," Ethan said. "He killed Raymond Mercer, and he lied about it until the day he died." The man nodded slowly. "He wasn't the only one who lied. My mother told me he'd been murdered by soldiers, that the army buried him somewhere overseas. She said my father had died a hero, but she never stopped crying when she thought I was asleep." Ethan took a step closer. "So you came back for revenge?" The man's smile was thin, almost pitying. "No. I came back to make peace with the truth, to bury what's left of him and what's left of us. But you wouldn't stop digging." Ethan's temper flared. "You can't bury the truth forever." "Maybe not," the man said, "but I can bury the past. That's what I came to do tonight." He turned slightly and Ethan saw the gleam of metal in his hand, the revolver. Not the one Ethan carried, but its twin. Henry's gun, the same kind that had ended Mercer's life decades ago. "You really think this will fix anything?" Ethan asked. "It's not about fixing," the man said softly. "It's about stopping." The silence between them stretched. The water whispered beneath the ice, the faint rhythm of something eternal. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. He took one slow step forward, his boots crunching in the frost. "You don't have to do this," he said. "We can take the body to the sheriff. Let them handle it. No more lies, no more running." The man shook his head. "The sheriff will dig until he finds everything. He'll drag your name, my name, Henry's, Rachel's, all of them through the mud. What little dignity we have left will die with it." Ethan's voice broke. "You can't rewrite what happened." "I'm not trying to," the man said. "I'm trying to erase it." They stood there, two shadows at the edge of the world, bound by the blood of a man who had damned them both. The revolver in Ethan's coat felt like a weight pulling him into his grandfather's sins. For a moment, he thought of throwing it into the creek, ending it all without violence. But he knew that was no longer an option. The stranger took a step closer, raising the gun slightly. "I'm sorry, brother," he said, "but this ends with me." Ethan moved before he could think. His hand found the revolver, the motion instinctive. The sound of the first shot shattered the quiet. The echo bounced off the hills and came back a moment later, softer, almost mournful. The man staggered, looked down at the spreading dark across his chest, then up at Ethan with something like understanding. He fell to his knees beside the creek. "He said the same thing," he whispered, "the night he shot Raymond, that it was the only way." His breath came shallow, his eyes glassy. "History doesn't forget, Ethan. It just waits for someone to make the same mistake." Ethan dropped beside him, catching him as he fell. The man's weight was solid, heavy, already growing cold. When it was over, Ethan sat for a long time by the water, the revolver hanging limp in his hand, the sound of his brother's last words echoing against the ice. By the time he rose, the sky had darkened to iron. The first flakes of snow drifted through the air, settling on the man's coat. Ethan began to dig. The earth was hard, frozen at the surface, but beneath it the soil yielded slowly to his effort. He dug until his hands bled, until sweat mixed with the snow in his hair. When the hole was deep enough, he lowered the body in and covered it with branches and earth. No headstone, no name, only the silence of the land to mark it. When he returned to the ranch, night had swallowed everything. The house stood dark, the windows like blind eyes. He went first to the barn. The air inside felt thicker now, as if it remembered what had just happened. The crates stood open, the bones within untouched. For the first time, Ethan didn't look away. He knelt beside them, took a deep breath, and spoke aloud. "You were his friend. You didn't deserve what he did to you, but I won't let him be the only one who pays for it anymore." He stayed there for a long time, the words dissolving into the shadows. When he rose, he gathered the letters, the photographs, the notes, and the confession Henry had left. He carried them outside to the old oak near the fence line, where his grandfather had once built fires. He struck a match and dropped it into the pile. The flame caught quickly, hungry for what had been kept secret too long. The letters curled and blackened, the ink vanishing into smoke. The photograph of Henry and Raymond burned last, the faces melting into one. When the fire died, Ethan returned to the barn. He found a length of wood from the pile of old boards and nailed it across the door. With the end of a nail, he carved words into the surface. "Do not open. The truth rests here." Then he turned, walking back through the snow. At the edge of the yard, he paused, looking back one last time. The barn loomed in the moonlight, silent, patient. He could almost hear his grandfather's voice carried on the wind, some echo of the man who had raised him, the man he had both loved and feared. He climbed into the truck, started the engine, and drove down the long dirt road toward the horizon. Behind him, the land grew smaller, swallowed by the white blur of snow. The lights of the ranch vanished, and the world ahead was nothing but the cold stretch of the unknown. When the last bend in the road hid the house from view, the wind rose again across the field. It passed over the barn, rattling the nailed boards on the door. Deep beneath the floor, under the weight of time and silence, the earth shifted slightly. The wood creaked, and for a brief moment, something knocked from below. One dull, heavy sound, like a heartbeat buried too deep to die. Then the night swallowed it, and the land was still once more. Suscríbete y activa las notificaciones para no perderte la próxima historia. Mira ahora los otros videos del canal. Cada uno guarda un secreto que no deberías pasar por alto. Comparte este video y cuéntame desde dónde lo estás viendo.